The city revealed its harshness under the cloak of night. The chill penetrated the fissures of aged structures, the neon glow pulsating on the damp ground, while the crowd hurried by, frantic and absorbed in their own existence, scarcely acknowledging those who remained in the shadows. James Calloway stood apart from the rest. He dedicated his whole existence to ensuring he stood apart from them, beyond the challenge, beyond the despair, above the realm that had once sought to shatter his spirit. He had fought his way to the pinnacle, crafted a dominion from the ground up, and vowed that he would never again experience the sting of powerlessness. Yet that evening, as he exited his vehicle onto the glistening pavement, his coat wrapped snugly around him, his thoughts were already consumed by work. He caught sight of her. For the first time in years, he found himself hesitating. She stood at the entrance of a convenience store, drenched, her arms cradling something delicate and precious, a child. Her hair adhered to her wan visage, her eyes vacant with fatigue, with deprivation. She wasn't pleading, not in the manner that was typically expected. She wasn't asking for loose coins. She wasn't gazing at anyone with anticipation. She stood there, her lips barely parted, murmuring something so softly that he nearly missed it. Kindly, I only require sufficient funds for a bottle of milk. James ought to have turned away. He ought to have disregarded the tug in his chest. This was not his concern. He had dedicated years to honing his ability to gaze ahead, resolute and unyielding to the pull of emotion or pity. Yet, his gaze held no trace of compassion for her. Just something different, perilous situation. There was an element that eluded his comprehension. Isla Carter experienced a profound sense of numbness. She found herself at the brink, the final vestige of her dignity slipping away like sand through her fingers. She had vowed she would never plead. She had vowed to herself that she would forever discover a path forward. However, this evening, her son had not had his meal. Tonight, Oliver held on to her tightly, his small frame trembling, his belly bare, his soft voice murmuring, "Mama, I'm hungry." What about this evening? She had let him down. She had finally set aside her pride and found herself standing before a shop brimming with items beyond her means, murmuring phrases she never imagined she would utter. Kindly, I only require sufficient funds for a bottle of milk. Then, a shadow emerged. A man, tall and imposing, gazing at her with an intensity she couldn't quite identify. Something exceedingly intense. She steeled herself against the harshness to come, regarding apathy. Instead, he delved into his coat, extracted his wallet, and presented her with a pristine $100 bill. She fluttered her eyelashes, stilled, for she had always received nothing more than a fleeting, indifferent look. And yet, there stood this unfamiliar figure, this man adorned in opulence and authority, offering her a sum substantial enough to nourish her son for weeks. She took a deep breath. This is too much for me to handle. His voice carried a serene quality, consistent, steadfast. Absolutely, you can. Her fingers quivered as she accepted the bill, clutching it firmly, her breath unsteady. She ought to have expressed her gratitude. He ought to have vanished, to have slipped away before he reconsidered. However, in contrast, she raised her gaze. In that instant, an unspoken connection formed between them. An unforeseen turn of events for both of them. Something that caught them both off guard. James observed her pause, her body rigid, her lips slightly parted as though she were on the verge of speaking. Without uttering another word, she pivoted and entered the store, the child grasping onto her tightly. He ought to have departed. He ought to have just climbed into his car and left her behind. However, instead, he lingered in anticipation. He found himself uncertain of the reason. Perhaps it was due to the fact that she hadn't regarded him with appreciation. Perhaps it was due to her moment of hesitation, as if pride were constricting her. Perhaps it was simply that, after so long, he had acted without weighing the consequences. He found himself uncertain about whether he felt remorse. Isla navigated the aisles, her fingers trembling as she reached for the milk, collecting a few more items. Bread, a banana for Oliver, Just enough, acutely aware that every dollar counted and none could be squandered. She averted her gaze from the window. I had no desire to find out if he remained present. For the reason that he was. She could begin to think that kindness was still a reality, and she simply couldn't allow herself to embrace notions that lacked authenticity. As she emerged into the open air, a small paper bag clutched in one hand and Oliver in the other. He remained present. For once, he took the initiative to speak first. Is there a destination you have in mind? Her heart raced with intensity. The response was negative. Yet, she found herself unable to share that with him. She raised her chin, infusing her voice with determination. Indeed, a moment of stillness. Subsequently, deceiver. Her breath caught in her throat. James observed her intently, his eyes keen, analyzing every detail. Isla despised it, disliked that he perceived too deeply, disliked that she struggled to conceal the truth. She pivoted, drawing Oliver nearer, prepared to step away, to fade back into the darkness that felt like home. Yet his voice brought her to a halt. I possess a location. She stood still. The language was straightforward. However, the significance behind them was not. She pivoted gradually, her heart pounding fiercely within her chest. You have no idea who I am. James let out a breath. Negative. However, I understand that assistance is required. Isla tightened her jaw. She ought not to. She was unable to. Yet, Oliver's small fingers clasped her hand tightly, and her son, her entire universe, was trembling. For the very first time in her existence, she had exhausted all her possibilities, thus defying all her instincts, ignoring the urgent warnings echoing in her mind. She murmured, "All right," and just like that, all was transformed. James guided her to his car, holding the door open as she paused for a brief moment, contemplating before finally stepping inside. He realized he had just erred. Due to his lack of assistance to others, he kept outsiders at bay. He was indifferent. Yet this evening, he had shown enough concern to pause. What comes next? At that moment, he found himself uncertain about whether he could simply turn and leave. The interior of the vehicle was enveloped in silence, excessively personal. Isla sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her arms encircling Oliver as though she could protect him from the strange world she had just entered. Her presence is unwarranted. She ought to have declined. Yet, when James Calloway had presented her with an escape from the chill, the gnawing hunger, and the relentless dread, she found herself with no options. Since Oliver was the first, without fail, she shifted her position ever so slightly, casting a brief look at the man next to her. Not a single word had escaped his lips since their arrival. His hold on the wheel was steady, his demeanor at ease, perhaps too at ease, reminiscent of someone accustomed to authority, someone who expected compliance without hesitation. Perhaps that was the reason for her deep-seated disdain. She had no obligations to him, and yet, in some inexplicable way, she sensed that she truly did. James kept his gaze fixed ahead as he drove, ignored the signs of her uneven breathing, the way her hands gripped the child just a bit too firmly, for he had witnessed far more than anyone should. He could see the weariness reflected in her gaze, the inadequacy of her coat against the chill, and the moment of doubt that lingered before she entered his vehicle. As if she anticipated the kindness would fade away, as if she anticipated him to retract his words. He let out a quick breath. An error occurred. An enormous error. He was not the sort of individual who engaged in matters beyond his own. He refrained from approaching unfamiliar faces on the street. He kept others at a distance, kept everyone at a distance, for it is in the act of allowing others to enter your world. They departed. He dedicated his whole existence to ensuring he would never endure such a profound sense of loss again. However, Isla Carter? That plan was doomed the moment she met his gaze, her eyes filled with a haunting depth. At this point, there was no option to retreat. Where are we headed? Isla finally spoke up, shattering the quiet that enveloped them. James focused intently on the road ahead. My abode. Her stomach nodded. What is the reason? A moment of stillness. Subsequently, a place to rest is essential. She let out a quick breath. So, you're just presenting one? Is it really that simple? James's grip on the wheel grew firmer. Negative. Negative. Her brow furrowed. So, what's the twist? He cast a fleeting look in her direction then. For the first time, she became aware of the keen sharpness in his gaze. What a challenge to comprehend. I don't engage in charity, he stated plainly. If you remain, you contribute. Her heart raced with intensity. Labor? He gave a slight nod. Maintaining order and cleanliness. Preparing meals. Anything that must be accomplished. She fluttered her eyelashes. Are you bringing me on board? James let out a breath. Refer to it as a setup. Isla's hands trembled. This was overwhelming. Way too quick. Yet, she found herself with no superior alternatives. And this man, this unexpected figure who had entered her world without a hint of forewarning, presented her with an experience unlike any she had encountered previously. Consistency, protection, and even if it wasn't for eternity, it sufficed. She inhaled deeply, and she struck the bargain. Understood. James gave a single nod, and just like that, their lives intertwined. His home was entirely different from what she had envisioned. It was far from the desolate, unwelcoming mansion she had envisioned. The warmth enveloped everything around, ample yet inviting, and after many years, she felt completely at home in her own reality. She sensed she was entering a realm that might belong to her. She dismissed the notion. She had discovered long ago the futility of wishing for things that were never destined to be hers. Without uttering a single word, James guided her inside, subtly indicating a guest room further down the hall. You will remain here. Isla paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. It was exceedingly pleasant, excessively pristine, excessive. Yet, before she had the chance to voice her objections, he had already begun to walk away, creating space between them, in some way, that let her down more than it ought to have. That night, as she rested in a bed that felt overly plush, Oliver nestled beside her, his breathing steady for the first time in days. She was certain she had chosen wisely, yet she was undeniably aware of one truth. James Calloway was a man who offered assistance only when it served a purpose. Eventually, it will happen. She would uncover the truth behind it all. James remained awake. He lingered in his office, gazing out at the city skyline, swirling the whiskey in his glass, contemplating the choices he had just made. This was not part of the plan. He was never meant to care. However, at this moment, a woman lay asleep in his house. A woman who regarded him as something beyond merely a wealthy man. A woman who expressed her gratitude in silence. What's even more frustrating, he felt no remorse. Not at all. James Calloway had consistently maintained a meticulously organized existence. All things were in their rightful spots. Each individual possessed a unique purpose. What about feelings? They were irrelevant to his existence. Isla Carter was throwing everything into disarray. She glided through his home as if it were her own. Yet there was a lingering uncertainty, a sense that she was poised for him to ask her to go. She put in more effort than was required. She maintained a low profile, never seeking anything beyond what was offered. And the most troubling part? She was burrowing into his thoughts. James found himself at a loss, unable to find a way to halt the unfolding situation. Isla had spent a week in his house by now. 7 days of rising to stillness, of discovering the rhythm of a home far too expansive for a single soul. 7 days spent evading the intensity of James's gaze when he believed she was unaware. 7 days of anticipation for the instant he realized he had erred. Yet it had not arrived. Not at this moment. And that filled her with a deeper fear than anything else. If he hadn't been the one to push her away initially, she was uncertain if she possessed the courage to leave by herself. It was late when she discovered him in the kitchen. She descended the stairs for a drink, anticipating solitude in the house. Instead, she discovered him. James leaned against the counter, his tie askew, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. In his grasp, a drink rested. He sat comfortably, yet his face revealed an underlying tension, something left unsaid. She paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. It would be wise for her to turn around. It would be best for her to return upstairs. However, instead, "Seems you don't get much rest, huh?" James looked up, his blue eyes shimmering in the soft glow of the dim light. Negative. A moment of stillness. Subsequently, "Neither do you." Isla took a deep breath, moving deeper into the kitchen. It's challenging to find rest when you're unfamiliar with it. His jaw clenched ever so slightly. She hadn't intended to express it. I didn't intend to reveal anything. Yet it was indeed a fact. She had devoted years to mastering the art of light sleep, ever alert to the faintest sound, always poised for the instant she might need to flee once more. However, here, within these walls, in this peculiar, hushed setting, she experienced a sense of security. That posed a significant risk, for the reason that safety was an illusion, an ephemeral mirage, a fragile existence, poised to be torn asunder at any instant. James observed her intently for an extended period. Subsequently, "There's no need for fear in this space." Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't quite understand why that particular thought caused her chest to constrict. The significance of those words. Because they were not genuine. Not quite. Eventually, the time would come for her to depart. She needed to keep reminding herself that this place was not where she belonged. James Calloway was never meant to be hers to keep. Yet, at this very instant, she yearned to trust him. She gave a single nod, and allow the quiet to linger in the space between them. James observed her departure, her petite silhouette fading as she ascended the stairs. And for the first time in ages, he longed for a companion to remain by his side. Yet, he was uncertain if he could bring himself to ask her to. Not at this moment. Not when he lacked any comprehension of the reasons behind it. James Calloway had constructed his existence on the foundation of control. Authority over his enterprise. Mastery of his feelings. Authority over those who entered and exited his realm. Yet Isla Carter was an enigma he couldn't master. She glided through his home like a gentle breeze, taking only what was necessary, never seeking more than what was offered. Still, she seemed to be omnipresent. The soft scent of lavender on his pillows spoke of her presence long after she had changed the sheets. Amidst the soft melody of her humming, she glided through the kitchen, preparing breakfast for Oliver. The atmosphere of his home had shifted, becoming less hollow since her presence graced it. James found himself at a loss when faced with that situation. I was at a loss on how to handle her. Isla Carter was more than just a fleeting presence in his journey. She decided to remain. And what about that? That was quite perilous. Due to James's refusal to allow anyone to remain. And he certainly didn't allow himself to desire them. Isla sensed the looming danger. She had devoted weeks to reassuring herself that this was not a lasting situation. James was a figure of practicality, lacking in genuine warmth. Her presence was a result of his bargain, not a reflection of any genuine concern. However, subsequently he would take action, elements that allowed her to escape her thoughts. He always ensured Oliver had the finest food, never bringing up how the pantry seemed to magically restock with all of her son's favorites. He always left the light on in the hallway at night, as if he understood her fear of the dark, as if he knew the sensation of waking up in strange surroundings, heart racing with the dread that everything might have been lost once more. There was something captivating about the way he gazed at her on certain occasions. She noticed the intensity of his gaze upon her at that moment. The hour had grown late once more. Silence enveloped the house. She was immersed in her reading in the library, a rare sanctuary where she had permitted herself to feel at ease when she sensed his presence. She tilted her head ever so slightly, her heart racing in response. James stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, his expression a mystery, observing her, perpetually observing her. Her throat constricted. It would be wise to embrace the comfort of sleep. His lips quivered slightly. Therefore, it would be wise for you to do so. She let out a breath, shutting the book with a sense of finality. Unable to, a moment of stillness. Subsequently, join me on this journey. Her breath caught in her throat. Where is it? James remained silent. He simply bided his time. And in spite of all the cautions echoing in her mind, she rose to her feet, and she trailed behind him. He guided her out into the open air, into the darkness. The garden lay in serene silence, the fragrance of roses heavy in the crisp air. Isla embraced herself, a slight shiver coursing through her body. James observed. He casually tossed aside his jacket, silently without uttering a sound. She let it cascade over her shoulders. Her stomach churned. This was not an act of kindness. This was truly extraordinary. It was an unspoken feeling, lingering just beneath the surface. Something she was forbidden to desire. She took a deep breath. What brings us to this place? James remained silent for an extended period. Subsequently, I craved fresh air. Her brow furrowed. And you brought me along? He let out a breath. You simplify the act of breathing. Her heart felt heavy. She found herself at a loss for words in response to that. She struggled to articulate her emotions, that he had transformed into the most secure presence in her life. She only felt at peace when he was close by, that she desired him. Indeed, she ought not to, because James Calloway was not a man destined for someone like her. He embodied dominance and authority, unyielding and cold, and she was insignificant. Yet, as he pivoted towards her, as he raised his hand to gently tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingered softly against her skin. She overlooked it. She allowed herself to let go of the past. As he softly uttered her name, as his breath brushed against her lips, the proximity felt electric, almost overwhelming. She longed for his lips to meet hers. However, James did not. He tightened his jaw, receded, and just like that, the opportunity had slipped away. Isla found herself restless that night. Not following that. Not after the way James had nearly pressed his lips to hers. Not in the manner she had envisioned for him. And she was aware. An error occurred. Whatever this may be, whatever was unfolding between them, it was impossible. Because men like James Calloway never fell for women like her. And she doubted her ability to endure if he validated her fears. James felt his hold slipping away. He had devoted years to isolating himself, maintaining a barrier between himself and others. However, Isla Carter? She was falling through the gaps. And if he allowed this to progress any further, should he allow himself to descend, there would be no return. The following morning, he resolved to take action. A harsh but essential choice. He would distance himself from her. Prior to the moment of no return, James Calloway had devoted years to mastering the craft of emotional distance. Individuals drifted in and out of his life, yet he remained emotionally detached. He always kept others at a distance to shield himself from pain. And yet, Isla Carter had glided past his barriers like a soft murmur in the night. That was perilous, because James was unaware of the essence of love. I wasn't sure how to hold on to people. Thus, he took the sole course of action available to him. He forcefully distanced himself from her. It began with a whisper. He ceased to linger in the kitchen as she prepared breakfast. I averted my gaze from her at the dinner table as Oliver recounted his day. I ceased observing her when she was unaware. Yet Isla sensed it, experienced the separation. A chill began to seep in once more, settling between them, and it pained me more than it ought to have. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to think that she held significance in his life. She was more than a fleeting presence in his world. Yet she was not. And now, James was ensuring she was fully aware of it. 3 days went by before she faced him. 3 days of quietude. 3 days of feigning normalcy while everything was far from it. She discovered him in his office, gazing out the window, his face a mask of mystery. "Why are you doing this?" she inquired, her voice unwavering even as turmoil raged within her. James remained facing away, remained still. "I'm not quite sure I understand your point." Her fingers clenched tightly into fists. Be honest with me. Quietude. Subsequently, it was an error. Her breath caught in her throat. James finally turned, his icy blue eyes filled with detachment. Whatever this may be, he stated, his tone steady, indifferent, merciless. It must come to an end. Her stomach churned. For there it lay, the reality she had been desperately avoiding. She took a deep breath. It appeared you didn't consider it a mistake the other night. James tightened his jaw. He let out a sharp breath, dragging his hand down his face. I allowed circumstances to escalate beyond control. Her heart throbbed with a dull pain. Too far, she murmured, her voice scarcely rising above a whisper. James gave a single nod, chilly, concluding, as if he were entombing the past, ensuring that whatever had transpired between them would never have the opportunity to materialize. And Isla despised that it remained a reality, although he wouldn't acknowledge it. Even though he had already released her, she compelled herself to stand tall, to hold his gaze without faltering. Very well, she replied. Just a single word. Incisive. Concluding. She pivoted gracefully and strode off into the distance. And this moment, James released her, as the door softly clicked shut behind her. As the silence enveloped him, it pressed down on his chest like an unshakable burden. He pondered whether he had just committed the gravest error of his existence. Isla remained composed. She had the desire to, yet she chose not to. Instead, she retreated to her room, gathered a small bag, and perched on the edge of the bed, her gaze fixed on the floor. She had anticipated this outcome. I had sensed it approaching, because individuals like James Calloway excluded those like her. Not quite. She had merely been deceiving herself into thinking she was unique. She stood out in her uniqueness. She let out a quick breath, her hands moving to her face in a weary gesture. She was compelled to depart. She was compelled to, remaining here, residing in his home, within his realm, understanding that he had no desire for her. It would shatter her. She had endured too many fractures in her spirit already. The following morning, she discovered him in the hallway. She found herself questioning whether he had been anticipating her arrival, or if it was merely a matter of unfortunate timing. Yet, when his gaze fell upon the bag she held, he stood still. Isla raised her chin defiantly. I will have departed by tonight. James's jaw clenched. There's no need for that. She chuckled softly, concise, harsh. Your message was unmistakably conveyed that I am out of place here. James let out a breath through his nostrils. That's not what I intended. She interrupted him. It holds no significance. Simply did not. For whatever he intended, whatever reality lay hidden beneath his icy expressions, it did not alter his actions. What he had selected. She strolled by him, never glanced back. He wasn't allowed the opportunity to express anything further. And James, after a long hiatus, he sensed a fracture deep within himself, an issue beyond his repair. However, that evening, as Isla gathered Oliver's belongings, she was getting ready to depart. A knock echoed through her door. She gently shut her eyes, steeled herself. Subsequently, step inside. With a gentle creak, the door swung open, and there he stood, appearing as if he had just come to the unsettling realization that he was on the verge of losing something precious to him. His voice carried a gentle hush, unrefined, wobbly. Please stay. Her breath caught in her throat. He was asking her to be a part of something more profound. He was imploring. And Isla, she questioned whether she still possessed the strength to turn away. Isla remained motionless in the softly illuminated space, James's words suspended in the air around them, a delicate thread of hope, urgent, yet seemingly beyond reach. Please stay. She tried to dismiss the way her heart tightened at the sound of his voice. She wished to feign ignorance to the unrefined quality within it, the apprehension, the remorse. James Calloway was not the type of man to plead. And yet, here he stood, positioned in her threshold, requesting her to remain. She took a deep breath, steeling herself to meet his gaze. His suit jacket was absent, sleeves rolled up, hair a bit tousled, as if he had been running his fingers through it, as if he had spent the whole night grappling with his own thoughts. Perhaps he indeed had. Perhaps this was his moment of unraveling. Perhaps this was genuine. However, it did not alter his previous statements. It didn't alter the reality that he had distanced himself from her. She raised her chin, her voice calm, unwavering, composed. You mentioned that this was an error. James took a deep breath. I acknowledge my mistake. Her stomach churned. She longed to hear those words. Days and weeks had passed, filled with anticipation for him to understand the connection that existed between them. However, now that he possessed it, at this moment he had arrived. It seemed far too perilous to place any faith in it. It's far too perilous to place my trust in him. James advanced with deliberate slowness. Then one more, until he approached her, allowing her to sense the warmth emanating from his body, near enough to desire. Yet he refrained from making contact with her, failed to extend a hand towards her, for he was aware. This time the decision rested solely in her hands. I pushed you away because I was scared, he confessed. Her breath caught in her throat. James Calloway, fearful? It appeared utterly implausible. And yet, at this moment he stood before us. His walls are falling apart. This isn't something I engage in, Isla. His voice had a gritty texture. I don't experience emotions in this way. Her throat constricted. So what brings you here? He let out a breath. His eyes locked onto hers with intensity. For the simple reason that I cannot bear to be without you. The revelation broke something deep within her. This was not a person who spoke insincerely. This was not a man prone to love. And still, for her, he was making an effort. Perhaps that sufficed. The stillness lingered, dense, weighty, a decision poised on the brink of realization. Subsequently, gently, with precision, she extended her hand toward him. Her fingers lightly grazed his, and just like that, James has fallen apart. He enveloped her in his embrace, his hold strong and urgent, as if he feared she might vanish from his grasp once more, as if he couldn't survive without her. What about Isla? She allowed him. Perhaps she required him as well. His lips brushed against hers, lingeringly, with a touch of uncertainty, as if he were still attempting to persuade himself that this was indeed reality, that she truly existed. Yet, as she surrendered to him, as her fingers glided over his chest, as she embraced the moment, the grip was lost. His fingers wove through her hair, the kiss growing more intense, his breath unsteady as he surrendered to what had been destined from the beginning. This was more than a mere kiss. It was an act of yielding, a vow, a quiet request to hold on forever. What about Isla? After a long time, showed no hesitation in clinging tightly. Hours later, as she reclined next to him, her head nestled against his chest, absorbing the steady cadence of his heartbeat, she softly voiced the question that had been pressing on her mind. What comes next? James gripped her firmly. We come to a solution. She let out a breath. She allowed herself to have faith in it. Within him, and for the very first time, James Calloway, a man who had always kept his distance, had devoted his life to evading the embrace of love. He had finally discovered something he was determined to hold on to. Epilogue, a love that endured. Half a year had passed, and Isla Carter was no longer the figure in the downpour, pleading for milk. She had returned to her sanctuary. She had stopped merely existing. She existed. Oliver's room overflowed with an array of toys and a collection of books. She embraced a career of her own choosing rather than one imposed upon her. And James? James was no longer the same. Not entirely. Take it step by step. Yet, in every significant aspect, he had allowed her to enter, allowed Oliver to enter. He had discovered the art of love, even when it filled him with fear. As they lounged on the couch that evening, Oliver nestled comfortably between them. James's arm draped casually around her shoulders. Isla came to a realization. She had not merely fallen for a millionaire. She had succumbed to the allure of a man. Complex, reserved, flawed individual. Yet a man who had selected her. Repeatedly. What about this? This is just the start.